All right, good afternoon, everyone. Still not a morning class. Well, we'll get there eventually. All right, so today we're going to keep on talking about language. And so I mentioned last time we start with language and we'll eventually be transitioning over into thought, and specifically how language helps shape the way that we think. So today is going to be mostly about finishing up this last little bit about the parts of the brain that are involved in different language activities. And then we're going to talk about how we acquire language and some of the theories around that. So we had looked at this diagram. This was a nice one that I had borrowed from back when we were talking about sensation and perception, because it shows us where our Broca's area and Wernicke's area are. It also shows us that primary motor cortex that's involved in sort of producing both gestures and all the stuff required for making sounds. And then we kind of generally, vaguely gestured to where the auditory cortex and the visual cortex would be, because those would also be important in incoming information. But this is sort of a nice little diagram to have for reference, because we're going to switch over and start looking at actual brain scans. And so these are looking at, did I set it up right? I did, perfect. So these are set up exactly like an overlay of the diagram on the previous slide. So they've outlined where the temporal lobe is, and then they've given you an outline of the brain. And so the way that we can interpret these, and these are specifically PET scans, if you remember back to when we talked about different kinds of brain imaging. So these would be PET scans, and they're just showing activity in the brain. So closer to white is going to be high levels of activity. Red is sort of still high but not maxed out. And then all the way down to sort of the bluish purple is very low levels of activity. And then the areas that are black are probably those that they've excluded. So with these, as we mentioned before, they'd probably run multiple trials. This wouldn't just be a single exposure or a single case. They do this multiple times because, as we said, our brain is active in a lot of different areas. So they do a lot of different tests and subtract out the aspects that are unrelated to the task at hand. So kind of like they'd get a baseline level of brain activity, and then they'd subtract that out for when we're looking at, say, listening to words versus seeing words, just so that we could see what's relevant. And so here we can see, okay, so hearing words, that would involve our auditory cortex, and that's pretty much exactly where it's lit up. And if we scroll back, so it's just sort of in the same area as our Wernicke's area, or very close to it, just behind it. So that would be our primary auditory cortex. We also have seeing words, and that's in the occipital lobe. That would be our primary visual cortex, just like we'd expect. Speaking words moves up a little bit of the Broca's area, and then also majorly in our motor cortex, like we said. And then generating words, that's the process where we're thinking about it, and that's moving into that frontal cortex, but still involving Broca's area. So for here, it would be sort of Broca's area and forward. So that's kind of a nice way to sort of present that. So you can kind of see that, yeah, the areas that we've talked about, we also get brain imaging showing activity that gives us about the same picture that we just talked through. All right, and so of course, whenever we do studies like this, people are always interested in sex differences. And for this, it's actually kind of hard to get a concrete agreement within the field as to whether or not there are sex differences. So we're gonna make some statements based on sort of the majority of studies. You might find some that are in agreement or in complete disagreement or somewhere in the middle, but that's just literature for you. And so we do see, at least in a lot of cases, that there's a slight difference in how things are organized between male and female brains. And so we do see that, I think we've talked about this before, where female brains tend to be just a little bit more non-lateralized. Basically, everything is spread out a little bit more. And so in male brains, there's more of that lateralization, where language abilities would be more on the left side. And what that means is that women who suffer brain damage, specifically stroke to one of the language areas, they're a lot less likely to suffer aphasia, that inability to produce or understand language, depending on where it's damaged, because of that diffused sort of functionality. Whereas male brains that suffer the same damage would be a lot more likely to have issues if the damage is on the left side. All right. And then, okay, yeah, and this was just fMRI images instead of our PET scan images here. Again, just showing activity, and it's showing left activation for male brains and bilateral, or both hemispheres, being activated for female brains. So just giving us a little bit of carrying back into those brain imaging studies and showing that what we're talking about actually shows up in those images as well. All right. So that's what I wanted to cover about sort of brain areas and what we're talking about there. If you go on into sort of other things on language, if you go into other classes where you get into more on language, they might care more specifically about exact pathways and more complex setups. We're keeping it fairly high level as per usual. But now that we know what language is, and we've talked a bit about how we produce it and understand it and which areas are involved, let's take a step sort of back, I guess, and start talking about learning to speak a language. How do we learn to speak or write or sign a language? Because as I've mentioned before, we typically talk mostly about spoken language just because that's where most of the research has been done. But most of these ideas, most of these concepts also apply to both written and signed language as well. So it's not just spoken language. So we're going to talk about spoken, but keep in mind that it's all types of language. All right, and so of course, people have studied, especially in developmental psychology, the progression of acquiring language. So a subset of developmental psychology would focus in on language development. And so we have a couple of milestones, a couple of sort of steps that are typically hit in the same order across children. And they tend to be hit about the same time in their development. And so a lot of our initial vocalizations are going to be similar regardless of the language that the parents speak. And we kind of mentioned this before, that language is, at least when we're born, we are capable of producing all of those possible phonemes. We are capable of producing all of the sounds that are possible in any real language. We don't have a limitation on what language we can speak at birth. So crying, cooing, and babbling, sort of producing those sounds pretty much at random at first, that's all going to happen in different languages. And when we're talking about the child's language, we're talking about the language they're being exposed to. So usually the language that's spoken at home, their parents' language. By about 6 months of age, that babbling is a little bit less random, and it starts to resemble the surrounding language. What that means is they're going to drop the phonemes that aren't produced in their surrounding language. So if there's a certain type of sound that isn't used in English, but they only ever hear English, they're going to drop those other sounds that aren't needed. And then they're going to sort of slowly start shifting what sounds they babble to try and match actual words. And so at about a year of age, we start seeing our first real words. And we get a lot of cross-cultural similarity here, where the first word is almost always the name for their parents, because that's usually what they hear the most. Parents are usually saying mama, mama, and dada at the children to try and get them to say that. So that's going to be one of the first things that they can say because they hear it so often. There we go. I just wanted to double check. I had a bunch of notes here, but I've been talking sort of off the top of my head. But with our receptive versus expressive language at the bottom, this is just there to remind me to highlight the fact that what the children can produce, what they can express, isn't necessarily the same as what they can sort of receive. And maybe we go back to our example of language learning for us who are trying to pick up a second language. So like I said, I'm trying to learn French. That's been my pandemic hobby. And so I find that I can understand what's being said in that other language, but I can't necessarily produce something coherent in that language. So I can read it, I can hear it, and I can understand what's going on, but I can't necessarily respond. And that's the same with a lot of children. They found in some studies that even though a child at this very young age, when they only know a few words, they can't necessarily communicate a lot of things to someone else. But if you say things to them, they will show an understanding of a lot more concepts. So there's sort of that disconnect between what they can understand, but also what they can then produce in order to communicate back. All right, oh, I still don't have a down arrow. So when we get a little bit older, so we're starting to get into that sort of 18 to 24 months, and we find that as time goes on, the areas kind of blur a little bit here on our milestones. And that's just because some children are going to hit the milestones earlier than others, and that discrepancy just gets larger and larger as time goes on. But this is when we start seeing a massive increase in their vocabulary. So we could call it a vocabulary spurt. But basically, we start seeing that children are able to produce massive amounts of words. So maybe if you've had younger cousins or children of your own, you notice that they go from a couple of very specific phrases, and then all of a sudden, every word that they hear, they can repeat and parrot back at you. And so we see this massive increase. And so by the time children hit the first grade, their vocabulary is up to, say, 10,000 words. And then by the fifth grade, as many as 40,000. And yet when they're younger, they can start acquiring these at such a rate, maybe even 20 words per week in this sort of 18 to 24 months range. So by the time they're 2, they're acquiring almost 20 words a week, which is just massive. And we're actually going to talk about that massive rate of increase as something that indicates an underlying predisposition to acquire language, as opposed to just an environmental influence, but we'll come back to that. And we also see in this case, when children are learning so many new things, they're trying to map what they're learning onto what they already know. So that concept of, okay, so I know what a dog is this new thing that I'm seeing a dog as well, or is it not? Or maybe they meet a new dog and you tell them that it's not just a dog, it's a husky. And then maybe they think that all dogs are huskies. So they sort of have this difficulty of figuring out how the words relate to one another. So we can have sort of over and under extensions. An over extension would be that they're applying a term to a broader group than they should. And then an under extension would be that they're referring to a specific thing when the word is a lot more general. So they might think that a dog's name is dog, but that's, his group. All dogs would be dog, and that dog in particular has a full name of its own. So there's a couple of different things like that they might struggle with, and that kind of makes sense when they're learning so many things, and they'll quickly adapt if you correct them and explain sort of the relationship between those words. They'll sort of move on from there. And then by the time we get past that second year, so after that 24 months, we start seeing the combinations of words. So we're building up in complexity here. So instead of saying single words at a time, we start seeing phrases. So things like telegraphic speech. So this would be if a child sort of gestures at a cookie and they say, "give cookie." That would be telegraphic speech. It isn't necessarily grammatically correct, but it includes all of the information that's required. And the name is actually from telegraphs. So when people were sending messages by telegraph, they had to pay for each letter that they sent. And so messages would be boiled down to the most simple concept needed to get the point across. So instead of saying, "I would like a cookie," please give it to me, they would say, give cookie. And that's what the children are doing. So that's why it's named telegraphic speech. So it's usually going to be a sort of a verb, and then the thing that they're pointing to, the thing that they want, or the thing that should be acted upon in a particular way. And we're going to start seeing that we can use a measure of mean length of utterance, MLU, because they always have weird ways of describing things. And this is just basically saying how long are their phrases at particular ages. So if you were listening to a child speak and you wanted some kind of measure of the complexity of their ability to communicate, you could use this MLU, where telegraphic speech is probably 2 words per utterance. But as they get sort of more complex, as they understand more complex concepts, and as they get towards more grammatically correct phrases, their utterances would get longer. So we'd start seeing, as they get older, that average length of utterance just gets longer because they know more and they can speak for longer periods. And then after their 3rd year, so another year added on there, we start seeing complex ideas. We see the introduction of, say, the plural. So they'd be able to correctly add a plural to most words. We start seeing past tense, so recognizing that not everything occurs right now, but they can refer to things that happened in the past. And then I just want to double check what I had said here for regularization. There we go. And this is what happens when a child will sort of incorrectly apply a grammar rule to a word that it doesn't really fit with. And this is a big thing in English. We have all sorts of weird ways to plural or change words with tense. If we think about mouse, and the plural is mice, whereas the rules would probably tell us that it should be something like mouses. And so that would be an over-regularization if the child assumes that a word follows the grammar rule, but it doesn't. So they would very quickly learn all of those exceptions just by exposure and then being corrected by their parents when they say it wrong. And there are lots and lots of ways that can happen. There's lots of weird quirks in English in particular, so those happen fairly frequently. All right, and then this diagram is just actually a really good way to break down all of those steps that we've just talked about. So this comes straight out of the textbook, and it gives us sort of that progression. So going from birth all the way down to 6 years of age. So it goes a little bit longer. And the older age stuff, we get into sort of age 4s up to 5-word sentences. So that mean length of utterance gets longer. And then we start getting more complex syntax, and then they start getting meta-linguistic awareness. And that's sort of a more, I guess, awareness of things that are past and present and future, things that may not even be happening, so they could imagine that something could happen. So just adding more complexity there. So that's a good summary of that. We don't go into all of those details because, again, you can take entire courses on language development. But as I've said, of course, when we start talking about this language acquisition, people are going to debate as to what's driving this rapid acquisition. Is it biological? Is it environmental? Is it genetic? What's going on? What is it that's allowing us to learn language so consistently across basically everywhere on the planet? And so some of the bits of, I guess, evidence that they've used to support a biological foundation, basically saying that we have some genetic predisposition towards acquiring language, that would be things like the fact that children learn language without formal instruction. So kids don't have to go to classes to learn how to speak. We're going to learn from our parents, from our caregivers, from those around us. And we pick it up very, very quickly in just a couple of years from that last sort of discussion on development. So we don't have to be trained in order to speak. We pick it up with fairly limited instruction just from exposure. We also see something for evidence of this biological foundation I guess the logic behind this is the fact that different cultures have different languages, but if we start seeing similarities between different cultures or different languages that don't necessarily share a root, then we're saying that there's something there that isn't just learned. So when you learn a language, you learn from someone else. So if we look at sort of separate languages that don't overlap in origins, at least not recently, and still see similarities, then we're saying that it's not similar because we learned it, it's similar because of some deeper biological factor. And that's their logic for the next one here. And this is saying that all languages end up having common deep structure. Basically saying that we can translate the meaning of phrases from one language to another. They're all saying effectively the same thing. And the fact that we're communicating in the same basic way, just using different words and phrases and languages, tells us that, yeah, there's probably something there underlying those languages. And again, we also see that our infants, up to about 3 months of age, when they're babbling, their vocalizations include all possible phonemes. So it's not that they're only able to do the things that their parents can do, they can babble for any language, which tells us that maybe we're set up from birth to be able to produce any language. So we have a genetic predisposition to speak whatever we're exposed to. And then we see that that sort of switches over where we start acquiring an ability to discriminate sounds, but specifically only in the language that we're exposed to. So if you did language discrimination tasks involving phonemes that your native language does not use, you might not be able to pick up those subtle differences between them. And so all of this has led to the sort of theory that there must be something that helps us acquire language. Maybe it's a gene, maybe it's a set of genes, something biological allows us to acquire language. And so this was mostly driven by Noam Chomsky. So if you've ever looked into language study, he is one of the big proponents for the fact that we are biologically hardwired to speak language. And so he proposed the existence of this language acquisition device, or LAD. And he basically said that we absolutely have something, some mechanism that exists that allows us to acquire language. So we are hardwired to do this. It is a biological imperative for us to be able to produce language. So there must be something in our DNA that lets us do this. And there are a lot of, well, we've just gone through all of the evidence, all of the things that say, yeah, there probably is a biological component. But years later, so this language acquisition device proposal was made back in the 80s. And they still don't have a single mechanism that they can point to say this right here is our language acquisition device. So it's still a general theory, but we do have lots of support for at least some contributions of our biology, some genetic contributors to our ability to produce language. Okay, and if we're considering that genetic component, we can also consider the environment. And this is kind of what we've been doing all throughout this course. We talk about our observable trait, our ability to produce language, as some combination of biology, of our genes, as well as our environment, what we're exposed to in our surroundings. So is there an environmental component? And so we can look at our social learning process, so learning from those around us. And this is typically done with parents, but if you, say, spent a lot of time with your grandparents as a child, or a babysitter, this is anyone you spent large amounts of time and heard language from. So even though the text typically says parents, this is just anyone with lots of exposure to you. But we typically see lots of high-pitched intonations. And this is basically baby talk. When people talk to babies, they tend to speak in a way that is very high-pitched. The proper term is child-directed speech. And interestingly, this is fairly consistent across multiple languages. So it's not just in English, it's in all sorts of languages. And I guess the intention there is to try and grab the child's attention so that they listen to the words that you're speaking. And typically, at least at the beginning, a lot of your speech directed at children involves naming objects and asking questions. So very simple language. You'd point to things, you'd ask them about things that they're interacting with. You're using words that, that sort of relate to what they are actively doing at the time, so that they can start associating those words with the things that they have around them. So if they're eating some of an apple, you'd be talking about apples. So they might start making that association between the word apple and the thing that they're tasting. And this should start being a little bit familiar, because we talked about his sort of a throwaway comment back in our chapter on learning, where we talked about B.F. Skinner, who was our sort of over-the-top behaviorist, who said that he could explain absolutely every aspect of human behavior simply through operant conditioning. And so he had said that our ability to speak, our ability to produce language, could be exclusively explained by operant conditioning. And so now we get to come back to that. And the way that he was saying this happened was we'd have positive reinforcement of appropriate language. If the child points to a dog and says dog, parents are usually going to say, yes, good job, positive reinforcement. If they say the wrong thing, they point to a dog and say cat, the parents will either not respond, so non-reinforcement, or they'll correct them. So correction of inappropriate language should lead them to then learn what the correct response is. And when they make the correct response, they are then positively reinforced. So maybe a little bit of shaping, a little bit of positive reinforcement, but we're getting children away from sort of the wrong language and towards the right language. So he said that, yeah, this can explain absolutely everything about our ability to acquire language. So there's no need to rely on biological pre-programming. But, of course, we have evidence against operant conditioning being the only factor. Not only did we just cover all of the reasons why there's probably some kind of biological underpinning, but when we start thinking about sort of certain aspects, and especially doing studies to say, how much does parental correction adjust language, things like that, we start seeing that it isn't as significant as maybe Skinner would have hoped. So that rapid spurt of learning that we see when children are learning up to 20 plus words a week, that's so far beyond what they should be able to sort of take in, given just operant conditioning. That's too quickly in order to, or for it to have just been caused by learning. There has to be something that facilitates that, some kind of biological underpinning. And in studies, when they actually looked at child-parent interactions, when they actually quantified what are the children saying, is it accurate or inaccurate, and what do the parents do in response, they actually find that parents don't correct grammar. So children still acquire grammar eventually, but parents only really focus on correcting deep structure errors. They tend to ignore surface structure errors. So if a child says that they goed to the store, and they did indeed just go to the store, despite the fact that they used the wrong sort of past tense of that verb, they sort of overgeneralized that grammar, the parents would be like, yeah, you did just go to the store. They wouldn't necessarily fix the grammatical incorrect part of it because the meaning was right. And so they focus on the meaning being correct over the grammar being correct. And yet, despite not always correcting the grammar, we do eventually learn to produce grammatically correct sentences. And lots of studies have shown that we don't have as much correction, as much sort of shifting, or I guess non-reinforcement of incorrect and positive reinforcement of correct to explain the rate at which things are learned. And so this proposed, I guess, sort of in contrast, instead of maybe our language acquisition device, our LAD, they said, okay, well, maybe it's not just biological only, and it's not just environmental only, it's not just social only. There's something in the middle. So the language acquisition support system, or LAS, because they really fit that in there to make them sort of match. But they said that this is something that helps contribute from, or include contributions from both genetics and environment. So this is saying that yes, we have some biological predispositions, but our social interactions, learning and exposure from our parents is also important. But neither factor on its own can completely explain our ability to acquire language. So this support system would be more of these things both have to be in place and they both have to work together for us to produce language typical or particular language typical vocalizations. All right. And so we actually start seeing a little bit of a debate here. So we're going to start talking about critical periods. And then I will explain why critical period might be a little bit too aggressive for what we actually see. But this idea of critical periods is basically saying that there's a certain age span during which you should be acquiring language. And if you don't acquire language during that critical period, then you can't acquire language, at least not to the same levels as someone who acquired their language during that period when you were able to learn language. And so the evidence that led to this proposal was the fact that children who are raised in isolation, they would then struggle to learn language if they were then sort of re-socialized after a particular age. So the age would be around, I think it's about 12 or 13 years old. So a little bit of wiggle room there. But they had, if you've seen news stories of children raised by wolves, they wouldn't be exposed to human language, so they would miss that critical period. And then when they were brought back into society, it took them a lot longer to learn language, and the language that they learned was a lot simpler and a lot less accurate than what others would have learned had they learned earlier. And so when they're younger, if we look at children who are, say, deprived of language up until only 5 or 6 years old, they were able to get back up to sort of normal levels of language competency because of that age. So it's kind of like there's a cutoff point where if you miss that window, your ability to acquire language sort of drops off pretty dramatically. So younger children have better ability to learn and catch up to that sort of level. And this is probably because when we're really young, our brains are very plastic. So when we're talking about plasticity, that's the idea of our brains being able to change and adapt, make lots more connections when we're young. This is why young children are actually a lot more able to recover from, say, severe brain injury. In an adult, our brains still have some plasticity, but not to the same extent. So if an adult were, say, to have damage to one hemisphere of their brain and had to have it removed, it might take them decades to recover mobility, and they might never get back to full functioning. But if, say, a 2-year-old is having severe seizures and has part of their brain removed, they would be able to get up to normal functioning in a couple of years probably. And so it's a really unique thing where when we're younger, we have lots of plasticity, lots of this ability to change and adapt how our brains make connections. So maybe that's related to why those critical periods are while we're young. And interestingly, any study of this critical period for non-spoken language, so if we're looking at written or signed language, same thing, same critical period. But where I'm going to deviate from the critical period idea is that it's not impossible to learn a language outside of that critical period. We'll talk in just a little bit about acquiring a second language, where it's easier to do when you're younger as well, but it's not impossible to learn later in life. And even those who were raised in isolation while they were younger, they were eventually able to produce some language. So that gives us evidence that maybe it's not a critical period, maybe it's not a hard cutoff where as soon as you're outside of this particular window, you can no longer acquire language. Maybe it's just a sensitive period. Basically, that means that during that window, we're set up and primed to learn the language, but outside of that, we could do it, it's just harder. So it's not an all or nothing setup like a critical period implies, but a sensitive period would imply that, okay, there is a little bit of sort of a optimal range and then a less optimal range, but it's not an all or nothing. So we will typically talk about sensitive periods, and it's just saying that it's less intensive than the term critical period would imply. And then so for our sort of groups of theorists, our different theories of language acquisition, we've already talked about Skinner, and Skinner was a behaviorist, so that's the same as what we had covered back in sort of earlier chapters. And so this was operant conditioning to reinforce language learning. So that's one camp. And we had said that that idea came up sort of in contrast to our Chomsky and his idea of biology-based or entirely genetic-driven acquisition. That was our language acquisition device, the LAD. And Chomsky would be called a nativist, basically saying that that language is innate. It's something that we are born with, and we don't learn it, it just happens. And so those were our two extremes at the beginning, and then when we transitioned to talk about there being a little bit of both, that's when we get into our interactionists. And so this focuses in on cognitive aspects and social communication, and we start seeing some emergenist theories, so that, again, interactions between the two, where you need both sort of that biological predisposition, but also that exposure. If you're not exposed to particular things, your ability to acquire language is going to be a lot, sort of very much impacted. And so we can start focusing on sort of cultural aspects, and then how our language and the way that we think about things, the way that we structure things, is eventually going to start influencing the way that we think about things. So if you don't have a word or a term for a particular thing, it's a lot harder to think about that thing. And it's kind of weird to actually think about not having concepts for things, because we think in whatever language we think in, usually the primary language that we were taught in. But I found that even when I was doing a lot more extensive exposure to French, some ideas were easier to conceptualize in a different language, just because of the structure of that language. So anyone who's bilingual, maybe you switch between the languages, maybe you use a hybrid of both, depending on which gives you the best description of a situation. So maybe it's easier to just use your native language, or maybe there are certain terms that just work really well in the other one. So the language that we use to describe things can change how we think about those things. And so we're going to come back to this concept when we get into sort of next week's content. But first, I want to take a very brief detour, and we're going to talk about bilingualism, so learning a second language. And this is something I've been sort of intercepting between all of the other topics, because it's a good way to illustrate some of these examples, because you don't necessarily remember learning to speak your primary language as a child, but if you had to take a second language in school, that's probably a lot easier to think about. And the process for learning a second language is actually very, very similar. And so we do run into some considerations. So I always use the example of I have two cousins, and I was sort of taught in English only school, where we had a French class. So we did one class in French every year, and that was it. But my cousins were in a French immersion school, and that meant that they had one English class and everything else was in French. They still spoke English at home because their parents didn't speak French, but they were exposed to French for much, much longer periods of time. And that's something that is especially common in Canada. It isn't necessarily seen in other parts of the world, but where Canada has two accepted national languages, we see both fairly commonly. So there have been tons of studies on the impacts of sort of using two languages. And one of the biggest questions is, does learning two languages at the same time cause problems? So if a child is being taught more than one language, is their proficiency in one of those languages going to be lower than someone who was just learning a single language? And so what we typically see is that they tend to have a smaller vocabulary per language. So I'll use my cousin's example of French immersion. So they were learning English and French at about the same time. They started French immersion when they were in kindergarten. So they were acquiring both languages at about the same time. And they found that their sort of reading level, which is an arbitrary way of deciding at what level or grade level they were reading, it was a little bit lower. They weren't as good at reading in English because they were also learning to read in French. Their vocabulary was a little bit smaller in English than someone who only learned English. And that kind of makes sense. If we think about having a limited set of resources, your brain is only able to acquire, at a very young age, say 20 words a week. Well, what if 10 of those are English and 10 of those are French? You're still learning 20 words a week, but if I was just learning English, I would be learning 20 English words as opposed to only the 10. So it can be advantageous, but it can also put you at a little bit of a detriment. And it isn't a direct split. It's not like they progress at half the level. It does have a lot of other factors that are involved. Okay, and I just want to make sure I say this right. Perfect. So a lot of times when we do see people who are taught two languages at the same time, even though their vocabularies might be limited, and even if it might take them just a little bit longer to get up to sort of certain milestones within a language, we do actually see that people who are bilingual will score higher on tests of things like cognitive flexibility, as well as analytical reasoning and selective attention, and even that sort of meta-linguistic awareness that we were talking about before, sort of being able to think abstractly. So if we think about this, the reasoning here is that, so if you're learning two languages at once, well, aren't they going to interfere with each other a little bit? You kind of have to think about, okay, well, was this word English or French or whatever else? And so if you're learning both at the same time and you're learning to speak them properly both at the same time, then you're getting really good at inhibiting the incorrect words. So if you are speaking English right now, then the French words are irrelevant, so you need to block them out and focus on the ones that actually work. And so that flexibility, that ability to say, okay, that's not relevant, I need this instead, it actually translates over into other areas. And we're going to look in just a couple of slides at some of the ways that they can test this, just looking at our ability to inhibit certain responses. So to not make a response, even though our gut reaction is to sort of say the wrong word or whatever. So having this extra challenge when you're learning actually has some long-term benefits. So even if your vocabulary is not as extensive, it still is beneficial in a lot of cases. Oh, that's the wrong way. And so we do see, I think I already covered a little bit of this, because you're learning things like a sort of split between the two languages, it takes you a little bit longer to acquire them. It can also be a little bit harder to process them. So we see a sort of a reduction in language processing speed, mostly again because of that interference between two languages at once. A lot of research finds that when children are younger, they tend to do that thing where they'll be talking and they'll be using words from both languages because they can't quite filter out which ones are relevant at the time. But as we get older, we get a lot better at that inhibition. We get a lot better at focusing on the language that we're supposed to be using. But we do still have, almost like our brains are preoccupied by keeping out the stuff that we don't need. So a very slight disadvantage when it comes to processing, mostly because there's just more to filter through. And I already mentioned that learning a second language, the same as learning a first language. It's a lot easier when you're younger. And I don't think the text goes into this, but when you are younger, it's almost like all the languages that you acquire are stored in the same place. So that concept of being set up or biologically predisposed to learn language at a younger age, it's basically like our brains are receptive to storing language-related concepts. So that would be sort of our language centers in the brain. If you learn a second language outside of that sensitive period, so if you don't pick up French until your 20s, then you're outside of the optimal place to learn French, but you can still learn it eventually. But if we look at brain scan studies where they see what part of the brain is active, if you learned French along with English at a young age, they're both stored in the same place, in those language centers. If you acquire French later, it'll be more diffusely spread out throughout the rest of your brain and not necessarily in the language center. And so what that means is if you learn it younger, you can almost sort of integrate that language into the way that you think and speak, and it's all one step. But if you learn it later, when you access that new language, you almost have to translate it into your native language and then get meaning from it. So they're introducing an extra step just because it's stored somewhere else. So those are very, very cool studies. Okay, and then the greater acculturation facilitates acquisition. This just means that the more you're exposed to that second language, the easier it is to learn it. So if you do a single French class over the course of a year, that's not as beneficial as French immersion, if you're exposed to that language all the time. So we see faster rates of acquisition with more exposure. And we already talked about executive control, and that's basically that idea of inhibiting other things that are going on. Basically improves your brain's ability to focus on what's relevant and ignore what is irrelevant. So that also benefits us for things like multitasking and focusing in on one thing while, we will eventually go back to the other thing. And this was just a diagram showing vocabulary size based on grades. That probably could have come in much, much earlier. All right. And I think the last couple of these, we'll finish bilingualism. It's only 2 slides here. So this is our measure of the ability to inhibit. So basically we're having, say, 2 keyboard letters. And so you're going to be pushing sort of the zero, or a 0 key for blue circles, and then a X key for red squares. And they might change this up on you. So at the beginning, they'd say focus on the color. And so then it's like, okay, so red things are this side and blue things are this side. But they'd be showing you images that don't quite match. So they'd show you, instead of a red square, they'd show you a red circle. And so you're supposed to pay attention to the color. So you would use the X key. And then halfway through the task, they say, now ignore the colors, pay attention to the shapes. So you'd have to then see a red circle and say, okay, the red is irrelevant. I need to look where the circle is. I need to use the O key. And so that's a selective inhibition task. And so it kind of checks your ability to switch up contingencies and inhibit responses that you are used to making. So individuals who have acquired a second language are a lot better at tasks like this, irrelevant of what it is they're looking at, if it's colors, shapes, letters, whatever. But it's a really neat setup. And then this was just sort of a graph showing that it's easier to acquire a language when you're younger. So we won't go into much detail on that. And then we'll start on next Monday. We'll start by talking very briefly about animals developing language, and then we'll transition over into our language's influence on thought. And so again, reminder, on Friday I will be here. I will be bringing in your exams if you want to go over those. You can ask questions, we can chat, but I won't be lecturing. So if you don't want to look at your midterm, if you don't have questions that you want to chat about, you don't have to come in on Friday. We'll pick up with the rest of the lecturing on Monday. Yes.